Welcome to our session on Women's Political Leadership is Essential for Democracy as part of the Global Democracy Coalition Forum. My name is Sophia Fernandez. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor Political Inclusion at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and it's my absolute pleasure to be co-hosting this event with DemoFinland. Both of our organisations have a very strong strategic commitment to advancing women's political participation and representation around the world. So this is a very, very apt event for us, and we have a very exciting panel today. This forum is a 24-hour virtual event that is being hosted in advance of the Summit for Democracy, which will be held later this week. And actually tomorrow, the United States and the government of Sweden is hosting an event as part of the summit, looking at advancing the status of women, is advancing the status of our democracy. So we couldn't be holding this conversation at more of an apt time. Our expectation is that we will be able to feed into the summit from the discussion today. My colleagues will be posting some links in the chat about the rest of the event, the Global Democracy Coalition Forum, and also about the Summit for Democracy event. Just as a matter of logistics, this event is being recorded. The chat function is available should you like to comment and join our conversation. We also have a hashtag for Twitter. And while we'll be having a conversation with our panelists, you're also welcome to submit your questions along the way in the Q&A function there as well. And so our panel, I'm very, very excited to briefly introduce each of our panel members. Joining us from the UK is the Right Honourable Maria Miller, the member for Basingstoke. Maria was the former Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and also the former Minister for Women and Equalities. Maria also held the chair of the Women and Equalities House of Commons Committee and pioneered that role, and now holds a range of positions as chairs of committees and of APPGs, all party parliamentary groups. She's also a member of the board of WFD. Joining us from Finland is Ambassador Katri Vinikka. It's a pleasure to have you, Ambassador. Ambassador Vinikka holds the position of Ambassador for Gender Equality at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland since 2018. She's had a long career in Finnish foreign policy, as well as in mediation. And last but not least, Sivire Grahube, our MP from South Africa for the Democratic Alliance. Sivire is currently the Shadow Minister for Health, so as you can imagine, it's probably been a very busy time, but it's such a pleasure to have you here in our panel today. So what we'll do, for us, I think, and for all our panelists, we would say that it's fairly obvious that there's a case for women political leaders and that we are all essential for thriving democracies. We know that women exercise political leadership, whether they are formally recognised for it or not, in formal and in informal spaces. And that it's not only a human right, but it's important for the success of societies for women to be represented at the decision-making table. But here we are making the case again, and we see globally over the last few years the regression, the backsliding, the increase of violence, and certainly the COVID-19 pandemic, amongst others, that has caused women to both leave the political space, but also really hesitate to enter it in the first place all around the world. So today, we're yet again making the case, and we're using data and evidence that we hope is unequivocal, as well as the lived experiences of each of the panelists here. And so firstly, I'd like to invite Maria Miller to set the scene, and then we'll move on into our conversation. So Maria, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you for the opportunity to open this really important discussion. And I'm sitting here today taking part from our own Parliament building here in Westminster, a Parliament building that's been here for hundreds of years, and a Parliament building that works hard to make sure that there is legitimacy for our democratic institutions in the UK. And it's really important that we acknowledge right at the start of this discussion that it is essential for our democratic institutions to be seen as legitimate and to be seen as representative as part of that. And indeed, the struggles and and strife of many hundreds of years has gone into making sure that whether it's women being able to vote or women being able to sit within our parliaments, these are things that have been long fought over, long discussed, but those battles and conversations are not yet over. Certainly not in my own parliament, where we still see just one in three of our parliamentarians being female, and ethnic minority representation being significantly below that which you would expect given the population of the United Kingdom as a whole. So I think there's a very large question mark over whether parliaments, including my own, are really taking seriously the issue of legitimacy when they're looking at how they present themselves and how they work with political parties to help recruit and encourage more representative individuals to come forward. And when it comes to the role of women within that, why would anybody want our political leadership at whatever level of government in the United Kingdom or in any country around the world to be anything other than the best it could be? And at the moment, too often, political parties are not effectively reaching out to the whole population when they're starting to recruit candidates for their legislative organisations, or indeed to be part of political discourse more broadly. At the moment, exactly what happens is it's almost as if we're trying to fight these battles to succeed to have better democracies with one hand tied behind our back, because we are not effectively reaching out to female residents to stand for political leadership. That's important for our democratic institutions, but it's also important for the quality of the policies that come forward, the quality of the debate about issues of the day, because there is now very little that can be argued to say that women don't have a unique position to bring. It's really important to acknowledge that the way women experience their lives, how they experience discrimination, how they have caring responsibilities, and indeed women's style of business, all are, bring something new and different to the political life, political discourse, and political institutions. It's essential that we continue to take this problem seriously, that we show that we put the burden not only on political parties, but onto parliamentary institutions as well, to make changes that are absolutely essential to show women that they are welcome into not only standing for election, but to be elected and to take on significant roles within those democratic institutions. We need to show women that they can succeed in standing for election. We need to reach out to more women to come forward to see this as part of what they can do to contribute back to their communities and their countries. And we need to support and retain women who do stand for election. Here in the UK Parliament, the average tenure of a female MP is significantly shorter than her male counterpart. So we take a long time to recruit women, we find it difficult to recruit women, and then we allow them to leave far more readily than their male counterparts. That's one thing that we need to work on, certainly in the UK. There can be few countries in the world that couldn't improve their situation for women in their elected bodies, in leadership positions, and throughout the political discourse that happens in media as well. And the UK is absolutely no exception to that. So I was absolutely delighted that WFD is taking on this issue so readily through this session today. And it really is fantastic, Sophia, to be able to be part of this and to hear the views of others. And I apologise, I'm not able to stay through the whole of the session, but I'm actually chairing a bill committee. So, and as one of the few women who are on the speakers panel, I need to make sure that I complete that task as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. And while we've got you, we'll start a little bit of the discussion and then know that you've got to leave very soon. So we've heard from Maria about the importance of women to be in the political space and at the decision-making table, and some of the ways that we can get there. Maybe I can start with you, Ambassador Vinica. What are three practical tips or three practical things that you would say about how to get that we need to be addressed to facilitate women's political participation?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. And it's really a pleasure for me to participate in this very important discussion. Concerning women's political participation, I would like to take up three practical things. And first of them, I think globally seen, is really the education of women and girls. I think women's and girls' education is a precondition for their political participation, because it's through education that women and girls become aware of their rights, including their political rights. And education also provides skills that help women participate in politics and public life. And I think that political participation today requires ability to understand very complex issues. So education obviously is one of the keys. Then secondly, and I think this is very Finnish approach, but successful as such, is the otherwise conducive environment, which includes sharing the care, because women, of course, are quite often, so to say, time poor. They have so many other responsibilities in most societies. They have to do most of the homework and bear the burden of unpaid care. So sharing the care is very important, and in Finland we are very proud of for instance, our childcare arrangements that have helped Finland to increase women's political participation. And I think that the more there are women in parliament, then easier it becomes to legislate even more progressive arrangements for sharing the care, for instance. And then the third aspect I would like to mention is to prevent online gender-based violence that women in politics increasingly face. I think it has become recently a really serious obstacle to women's political participation. As it was said, it may be difficult to recruit women for elections, and one of the reasons is the fear of being harassed. Hate speech is really a serious problem that Finland has tried to address in many ways, and also on international fora like Freedom Online Coalition and Generation Equality campaign led by the United Nations, where Finland has been advocating for this particular topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We'll come back and pick up on some of those points. I know, Maria, before you go, maybe I'll turn to you and then I'll turn over to Suviwe. So Maria, if I can turn to you for your top three areas that you would like addressed. I know you've been doing a lot of work in the UK on addressing online violence against women as well.
Absolutely, Sophia. And the Minister, I think, has picked up three really important issues. I'm going to try and add to that if I can, because I think there's so much work that's been done in this area that we can all learn from. I think we need to, within political parties and within parliaments, show women that they can succeed. Now, because of people like the Minister who we've just heard of, most countries have wonderful role models who we can use to encourage other women to see this as a legitimate part of their career planning. We need to be able to do that, but we need to create environments within our parliaments so that women can succeed at any age. So in the UK Parliament, we've been looking at how we can support women who might have children. It seems very odd to say that we've never accommodated women in that way before, but we now have proxy leave for parents, and we're looking at other things that we can do to support women who have children while they're elected. I think also it's psychological, and the Minister hinted at this, which we have to demonstrate that women can change things, because I think if they come into Parliament and find that politics is not a lever to pull, if you want to change society for the better, then they will go and do other things. They will go and run a charity. They will go and do something where they can pull that lever and see that change. The Minister talked about being time poor. I think it's even more philosophical than that. It's sort of, wanting to see change because their time is so short. And then the final thing I would say is our political model, certainly in the UK, is all about candidates putting themselves forward for election. Women don't work like that. They want to be asked. And so I'm a huge supporter of the Ask Her to Stand campaign here in the UK, run by 50/50 Parliament, because we have to ask women to stand for election. And every International Women's Day now, I run an event in my constituency and here in Parliament, which is all about asking women to stand, to put it on their radar, to challenge them to do it, but also to encourage them to do it. Because I think that women do not, they wait to be asked. They don't put themselves forward in the same way. But our political model is baked around a very male-centered political world.
Thanks, Maria Sibylle. I know you'll have a lot to say about this. So turning to you, what are your top 3 practical things that you would like to be addressed to advance women's political participation?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Sophia. I mean, I think that there are a number of things, and a number of them have already been mentioned. I do want to elaborate on the point that Maria made, particularly around asking women to stand, because I think the point that I'm about to make is very much linked to that ultimately, particularly in liberal organizations, at least, that don't believe in quotas, what you will have is a scenario where, unless women stand for political leadership, or they stand to be included in a list, or they stand to be elected as MPs, they won't be elected. And then it's very easy for political parties, for parliaments, for really political organizations to turn and say, well, we're not going to force women to stand. And therefore, this is why representation is so poor. And so I think that there needs to be 2 things, and I think it's 2-pronged. The one is definitely an encouragement for women to stand for political leadership and for them to see politics as a means to change circumstances in their countries. Secondly, I also think that the women who are in politics should also be working very hard to change the culture within political organizations, because I think that the culture can also be incredibly toxic, and the culture can also be incredibly repelling to people who are either talented or who doesn't have to be women, but people who have other options, who say, well, I'd much rather be an accountant and work towards that in my country, or I'd much rather run a charity than be stuck in a toxic political environment. And so I think the women who are within the political ranks need to make it a point that we do change our political cultures within our organizations. And we need to snuff out the culture that is repelling women to stand and to stay, because there's also something that also where women can stand but may not necessarily stay. And often people will say, well, if you don't have the longevity, then perhaps you don't belong in politics. It is then our duty to make sure that as people who've already put our hands up, how do we make sure that there's sustenance and people stay on? And then the last thing I will say for me, which is incredibly important, is that often, and I think particularly in the history of African politics, you used to have in political parties strong women's organizations or women's desks. And often I've found, particularly as a young politician, that these are often used to sideline women as a way to say, run for political leadership, but be the leader of the women's organization, be the leader of the women's desk, or lead the women's network. And ultimately what that does is that it alienates women to the sidelines to say that you deal with women issues on the sidelines there. You discuss gender-based violence, you discuss sexual harassment, come up with solutions to help you exist in politics. And almost you do your knitting on the side while we do the main political work in the main political parties. And my view is that that needs to change. We don't want to run for political positions in youth wings and women's desks. Women need to contest main political power in mainstream politics, because it's only then that you get to change things. And it's only then that you get to make what is seen as niche women's issues as the main political issues. And it's only then that we start to change the culture in politics. And it stops becoming about this boys' club, but it becomes a far more inclusive. So lots of issues that have been raised here by my colleagues, but added to that, I think we've got to look at it also with these additional points. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. Maria, would you like to come in on that about the culture inside politics and political parties and any of those points?
I thought that was a very inspiring contribution, and I noted down the points that were raised around this tension of women wanting to make sure that the issues that they can see very distinctly that need to be addressed, not then being used as a way of sidelining them into something which isn't of the mainstream. And as I say, I mean, political parties have got to make the running in this, but I think parliamentary institutions do as well. So if I take somewhere like my own parliament, where we struggle to get equal numbers of women leading select committees, which are asked very, very well-respected scrutiny function in the House of Commons, and the number of women who are chairing those select committees, which are cross-party, is significantly less than the number of men chairing those positions. And we were talking about how we might address that. And of course, one could immediately say, well, you have to have a 50-50 split of them. But I think that then doesn't actually address the underlying issue here, which is how we recruit people for these positions, how we elect them to those positions, and to really look at why women are not putting themselves forward in the first place. And in fact, in our parliament, you can look at even the asking of questions in the House is more dominated by men proportionately than women. So I think institutions should have an obligation to look at themselves, to challenge themselves about how they are supporting particularly women, but overall more diversity. And at the moment, certainly in our parliament, we do that somewhat. We look at the gender of people giving evidence to our select committees. We have some cursory oversight of the way women are treated within debates. But I think it needs to go one stage further if we're not to fall into the trap that the previous speaker was talking about, which is inadvertently sidelining women, even when they do reach an elected institution. After going through those battles, they then find themselves in some way sidelined and not able to participate in the way that they would if they were, as the example was used, an accountant or a lawyer or in any other profession.
Thanks, Maria. Ambassador Vinica, would you like to add a comment about political institutions and maybe even political parties, and what can they do to be truly inclusive, to really change the dynamic?
Oh, thank you so much. Well, that's a very important question indeed. Of course, it's as it was said. The organizational culture of the parties is very important indeed, and how to ensure that women really have equal opportunities both to join a party and also to become electoral candidates, and how to ensure that they will have the same resources, capacity building, as their male colleagues, for instance, training in the party and so on. So this is the first point maybe, but then the second one is that this is all rooted in the harmful social norms and gender stereotypes of our societies. So these social norms and stereotypes should be addressed and changed, and this is of course very, very challenging, something that has to begin I think in early childhood education, but political parties really should become truly inclusive and gender equal. And then of course what we are stressing a lot in Finland is at the moment is the intersectional approach, so that women are not a homogeneous group, but they are different. They have different ethnic backgrounds, maybe in Finland not to the same extent as in the UK, because in Finland migration is a younger phenomenon. But for instance, women with disabilities, this is something that we are stressing a lot in the foreign ministry at the moment. This is actually one of the priorities of our development policy, how to support women with disabilities. I mean, women have to be treated as diverse individuals, and it's really a threat to democracy if certain people or groups feel excluded from politics. Thank you.
Speaking about changing social norms, one of the ways that we've been finding in our research that we do see social norm changes when members of parliament like yourselves, Maria, like yourself, Sibiwe, work with feminist organizations, with women's rights organizations, with those in our community who can collectively work to shift some of this spaces. Maria, can you talk about some of those examples in your work?
Absolutely, Sophia. I mean, the area particularly I focus on is women in the workplace. And I've been working with a wide cross-section of organisations to address a number of issues which together can make it very difficult for women in the UK to achieve the same in their working life as their male counterparts, whether that's around gender pay gaps, and obviously organisations like the Fawcett Society do tremendous work on that, whether it's around sexual harassment in the workplace and how that can impact things for women who experience sexual harassment and even then are pushed out of the workplace if they lodge complaints. And the third area is the use of non-disclosure agreements to then cover up discrimination that women experience, whether that's something like sexual harassment or perhaps maternity discrimination. And I've been working for a number of years now with Maternity Alliance, Pregnant Then Screwed, which is another interest group in that area, and on non-disclosure agreements, working with Zelda Perkins, who was one of the people who suffered with regards to the Harvey Weinstein debacle over in Hollywood, and suffered with the use of a non-disclosure agreement in a very punitive way, which she speaks very movingly about. And I think it's by working with outside organisations, working with women who've experienced these sorts of issues, which too many people in Parliament haven't got first-hand experience of, you can really build a very strong narrative and hopefully demonstrate, going back to that point about making sure our democratic institutions are seen as legitimate, that to demonstrate to the electorate that actually democratic institutions do have people within them that understand the lives of half of the population.
Thanks, Maria. Sibuwe, in your work, and I know that you've entered Parliament as a young woman in your 20s, and now taking on a role as Deputy Whip. Congratulations on that position. It's a senior position in your party. How do you connect and bring in those voices from those movements outside the formal political space?
Thank you. And I think firstly, like Maria said, it's also about, attracting, or at the very least, working with organizations that could assist members of parliament in dealing, or at least influencing these areas of influence. But I also think it's also a talent attraction tool, right? Because I'm very passionate about saying, find politicians who've either done or led other lives, who want to come and use politics as a space to advance social change. And so if there are organizations that are led by incredibly talented people who are keen to run for public office, then that is one of the tools in which you can work with people and say, I want to work with these organizations. And it can also be a talent pool and a way of attracting talent to politics, because it is a worrisome phenomenon, in my view, that politics just simply becomes, or at least the chambers of parliament become just, a resting place for people who've either done it all and seen it all, as opposed to people who are energized and animated about effecting change. So it's a great way to attract talent and people who have expertise in these various fields. But also, I think it's also an important way to garner support for global movements, in the sense that women are able to women leaders in parliament are able to tap into those networks and get the kind of support that they need. For instance, platforms like this, you form networks across the world where you are able to learn from one another. You are able to implement some of the various things that are happening in other parts of the world, but also you're able to provide some real tangible support for people. Through platforms like this, I've met people who are members of parliament, or at least who are seeking to break into politics from the continent, where it's much more difficult for people there, than it is, for instance, for people like myself, or people in various other countries. And so these are great networks, because we're not going to be able to crack that ceiling, and we're not going to be able to really achieve some of these things unless we've got like-minded people who are willing to say, we want to lend support, and we want to put our shoulder to the wheel, and we're willing to do so across the world, because the project is bigger than us. It's bigger than your country. It is actually just a global project that needs to take off. And then lastly, I think it's also important to work with these kind of organizations and tap into research, because ultimately the issue around women in political leadership mustn't be about women that want to have a space to talk about their own issues, or a space where we can talk about soft issues. We want to be able to back the issue of gender equality and gender representation with real research, with real hard facts, and real research that shows that the more diverse your leadership is, the better it is, and the better you are at representing the people of your country. And so this is not about holding hands and being soft with one another and, sort of providing safe spaces for us to cry at the office. This is about real tangible issues that you can, and real tangible research that we can put on the table to say, when political organizations, when parliaments and democratic institutions are diverse, they are better at their job. It is just as clear as that. And ultimately, what it will also do is it will also allow us to contribute to legislation that can help us get to where we need to be. So collaboration is incredibly important. And I think that we've got to lean into it a lot more, and we've got to lean into some of the work that organizations are doing around the world, so that we're not to work in silos.
Exactly, Sibuwe. I couldn't agree more. And Ambassador Vinnick, you've had a long career in the Foreign Service, which is another space where women need to be absolutely present. And can you talk about how you've engaged with women's groups and women's rights organisations in your work?
Thank you. Well, I would say that women's organizations and feminist movements, they are really a key player in Finland as well, and also for the foreign ministry, they are really important resource, I would say. Actually, I would argue that in a small society such as Finland, because our resources are so scarce, so we really need everybody. So we need the expertise women's organizations can provide when preparing legislation or preparing our positions to international conferences. I think it's really a characteristic of Finnish society that we are used to kind of a multi-stakeholder approach, and really, I mean, we are on very good terms with each other, and we have really a powerful women's movement in Finland. And one example I would like to give is that the National Council of Women of Finland just celebrated the 110th anniversary this September. And yesterday, 6th of December, we had our National Day, and it was our 104th Independence Day. So the women's movement is older than our independence. And I think it shows something about Finland, and is one of the explanations to the fact that Finland was the first country to grant full political rights to women, even before our independence, actually. So very close cooperation with women's organizations and feminist movements, and I'm really grateful for that.
That's a fantastic achievement. We like to hear those kind of statistics here in this space. I'll turn now to some of the questions that have been coming in on the Q&A, and I certainly encourage others to please contribute to the discussion as well. Ambassador Vinica, you spoke about education as one of the real ways to start to address the challenge of bringing women into the political space. One of the questions we have is about, I guess, when do you start? Do you start in secondary schools, trying to think about that age of girls? And this is something that we've been speaking about at Westminster Foundation for Democracy as well. You know, how do the girls that we educate turn into the political leaders of tomorrow? I wonder if you could comment on that, Ambassador.
I think it's necessary to start as early as possible, and here I would once again like to refer to early childhood education. It's possible to start already there. I think it's necessary to start already there if you want to really address the harmful stereotypes. But then, of course, already primary school. There is some education, then secondary school, history, social studies. But what is also hugely important, and I think has played a tremendous role in Finland, is the power of role models, because we had. Our Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, who leads a very female-dominated government, actually has said that her inspiration for politics was the fact that when she was young, we had female president, our former president, Tarja Halonen. So young girls got the idea that the president is a woman. Like for my generation, there was one president who used to serve several terms, and he was the president for Finland in those days. But for younger generations, Mrs. Tarja Halonen has been a huge role model, and I think now we are also in a wonderful situation, talking about statistics that. Of the 19 cabinet ministers, 12 are women at the moment. So I'm quite proud of that, and I'm sure that this will serve as some kind of education as such as well.
Thank you, Ambassador, and certainly that point about role models, or certainly the work of those before us to bring some of the, as you said before, Sivive, the sidelined issues that tends to be the, gender equality issues tend to be considered sideline issues, and the work that's been done by yourself and others to bring it into the mainstream, and looking at those that have come before. Would you like to speak about that?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, I think, having representation for women in politics was quite important. I think that, of course, that is why we were talking about why it's important to make the vocation attractive to women, so that they too want to be able to step into political leadership and change things. Because I suppose then it becomes a cycle that the more women there are in politics and the more women who rise to prominent positions in political parties, then the more women would be able to want to be part of those organizations. And I think when it comes to particularly younger girls and younger women in school, I think what's really important there, as the ambassador said, particularly around education, is that when society raises young, confident women who don't harbor the feelings of inadequacy into their adult life, then you are able to cultivate them to be leaders in whatever industry. And that's important because, and I'm glad that the world is moving towards that direction of being able to cultivate a culture of confidence amongst young girls, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to have young women who will put up their hands and say, I want to lead industries. I can lead political parties. I can lead parliaments. And so that the ambassador is absolutely right, that it's absolutely crucial to start at a young age. But it's also equally important to not just simply sideline, or at the very least take young girls aside to indoctrinate this kind of thinking. It's equally important to teach young men about the importance of an equal world, because the reason why we are battling with a boys' club mentalities in political parties, in parliaments, is because men have not made the shift. And unless they make the shift, the toxic culture in politics is not going to change. The space is not going to be conducive. The issues we were talking about, gender-based violence, sexual harassment, they will remain fringe issues until we change the culture that men are also existing in. And so those two things are important to happen concurrently. Teaching young girls about their space in the world, but also teaching young men about the space that they need to occupy equally with women in industries, wherever they may end up, so that we can be able to say, when we run political parties together, that it's not because I'm a woman that I'm elected, it's because I am objectively excellent. And unless that can be accepted, we're still going to have a hard time. Ours is not, we shouldn't be occupied with the business of proving to people that we are just as good. And that's why that kind of work needs to happen very early in children's lives, so that they may be able to understand that, and that we're not dealing with difficult characters and misogyny later on in life, when these kind of cultures have been indoctrinated and are much harder to rid us of.
I very much agree with you, Sivive, and we've got a couple of questions in the chat and the Q&A about shifting that needle, and perhaps one of the ways that there's a suggestion that there's lots of opportunities, for example, in Ask Her to Vote, in twinning, in leadership academies, but how can we widen these opportunities to encourage women who are from perhaps lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or not elite backgrounds, from diverse backgrounds, to become active and eventually run for office?
I think that's a massive issue, and I think it was mentioned earlier about the intersectionality of the issues facing women and preventing women from thriving, from entering politics, and from thriving in that space. I mean, whether it is women of color, whether it is women, rural women, particularly in countries like ours, where there's a massive divide between women who reside in cities like myself and women who are locked out of economic opportunities and in rural areas. And how then do you flatten that playing field so that you can attract the various diversity, or at least the various inputs that they make? And I think, again, it goes back to what I mentioned around changing organizational cultures, because unless we are able to say, how are we attracting women to run for lists? How are we, how does your candidate selection look like? What are some of the issues, or so what are some of the key things you look like when you're looking at candidate selection? Are you looking at leadership track record? Are you looking at whether somebody is fluent in English or not? And some of those things can be exclusionary. And that's why we've got to infiltrate at the highest level of decision-making echelons in political parties in particular, so that we can change the standard at which people are judged by. So we can say, if a woman or anyone has proven track record that may not look like what you know, that in itself is an indication that they can make a solid contribution either in parliament or in local government councils. And so these are some of the tangible things I was talking about that we can start to shift: candidate selection. We can start to look at what Maria said earlier on about how do we encourage and inspire women to get into political leadership. It's not about providing a little lounge in parliament for women to cry. It's about changing tangible things, and it's about making sure that we change legislation and we remove the hindrances.
Ambassador Vinica, do you want to come in on that? And then I'll follow up with a question about international networks and knowing that Finland's got an incredible track record in supporting this work around the world. But I'll let you come in on that question as well.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I couldn't agree more with this. I mean, I think it was myself who mentioned the intersectional approach, but really women's different kind of women's groups have to be included, women in all their diversity. And I mentioned already women with disabilities, but then of course also, for instance, women from the LGBTIQ plus community. That's also very, very important. So the parties should be very inclusive, and I mean, it's not sometimes you have to kind of headhunt for representatives from these different groups, but you really have to do it to lead by example.
Thank you, Ambassador. We've got a question in the chat about the role of international networks and how we can better support these networks, but also the role of men. I mean, both of you have spoken about how men, can be allies, but there also needs to be a cultural shift in the space that legitimizes men's experiences, and how to shift that to think about women as being part of the human experience. And looking at your point, Sibiwe, that this is a universal issue rather than just a women's issue. So maybe I can start with you, Ambassador Vinica, on international networks to support women in politics, and how we could bolster that, but also how we can work with men in those networks.
Well, international networks are, of course, hugely important, and I think that many political parties have their own international networks, and they have women's organizations within them. But as you said, working with men and boys is really crucial. Gender equality cannot be only women's issue, and I think that I mean, we all know the term all male panel, but actually it's as detrimental as all male panelists is to have only all female panels. So I would really encourage everybody to invite also men to even to this kind of discussions if possible. But it's not easy. I mean, it's also my experience that different events on gender equality, it's so often preaching to the converted, so to say. But of course, there are some excellent male colleagues in my ministry, for instance, and otherwise in the Finnish society. And the culture is changing, but this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, of gender equality work in general. How to really involve women and boys, and therefore, I think, for instance, this He for She initiative that the UN launched some years ago was very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sivuve. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, as Ambassador said, I mean, political parties or parliaments or countries have their own sort of international networks that they rely on. But I think they're crucially important for various reasons. Number one, I think because of the support that international networks can provide for people. I mean, I've spoken at platforms where I mentioned earlier, where women in my own continent who are coming from countries that are far more, non-receptive to the issue, or at least to the idea of women contesting political power, but they are able to have conversations and meet up with other women who come from similar countries or who come from countries that have already made the strides. And that, in my view, were able to essentially really empower them to be able to say, let me take some lessons back to my own country or in my own circumstances. They're also good for fundraising purposes, really, because ultimately running, particularly for those people who have to run individual political campaigns, can be incredibly costly. Well, yet another reason why this can be a massive hindrance. A lot of my colleagues on the continent have to often fundraise for themselves and have to, raise the money to be able to run either an internal election or an election within the country's elections. And so those things are also quite important because it gives you a network that you can tap into like-minded people who believe in the project that is bigger than all of us and who can really assist you with that kind of work. And so that's also just a very practical example of why these kind of networks are incredibly important. And then lastly, I think that also, we've got to be able to also contribute to the discussions at the international networks and platforms like these ones. And I think that the more people and the more diverse some of these discussions are, the more we're able to move the discussion forward about to say, well, maybe 15 years ago, we were talking about how, or 10 years ago, we were talking about how to create support for politicians who decide to have children. But maybe in 5 years' time, we'll talk about how it's incredibly important for institutions to be completely open and encouraging to people of diverse backgrounds, trans women, women who have been otherwise, alienated. So I think there's a symbiotic relationships with the international networks where they can be greatly beneficial to people who are wanting to advance democracies in their own countries. But at the same time, we contribute to the international conversation by saying, this is currently where we are. This is currently some of the challenges that are happening on the ground. I know for a fact in South Africa, we're nowhere near talking about issues like, for instance, like I said, issues that trans women would face in trying to come into political office. And so those are the kind of things that we were only going to be able to move forward if we're able to lean on each other in that way.
Thanks, Sibuwe. One of the there's quite a few questions in the chat on the Q&A about harassment, violence and harassment of women in the political space. I think this does tie in a little bit with changing the culture that we've both been speaking about, changing the culture of the organizations, the political organizations that you work with, and changing the culture of what's accepted as leadership. And probably does link a little bit about allyship and how men can be allies in this space. Would you like to comment on that, Sibuwe, about facing harassment and how to address it?
Absolutely, and you would be, and I think this is a global phenomenon that women are still very much sexually harassed in workplaces, not just in politics, but in various other industries as well. And if you look, if one looks at the the global conversations that have been happening, whether it is the Me Too movement or conversations around consent, conversations around mutual respect in the workplace, you'll realize by just the visceral reaction that some of our own colleagues would have to those reactions or those conversations, that it is because they refuse to have an internal conversations with themselves. And they know that they too have been perpetrators of violence against women, and whether or not it was overt or whether or not it was through a comment. And so it's still something that is very, that is quite overt in politics. Whether it's sexism where, women are allocated portfolios of, women, children, and people with disabilities, or they're only allocated portfolios of social development. Not to say that those portfolios are not important, but it speaks to the boxing of women in a very particular way. Why are not women made secretaries of defense, of ministers of police? And that kind of sort of culture. So that's the one thing. The one thing it can be about boxing women. The other thing can be just experiencing sexual harassment from your own colleagues. We still, in 2021, will have people who will make overt sexual advances to women in the workplace as actual colleagues. And that kind of culture can't be changed by if we have these conversations on our own. And that's why I agree with Ambassador earlier. These conversations can't be limited to just us. Women don't rape themselves. Women are not harassing themselves. They are being harassed. They're being raped. They are being killed. And therefore, the conversation needs to go further than just saying the Women's League will have a seminar about the safety of women in the workplace. We need to have a parliamentary debate about how men, women are all going to contribute. They're all going to change their preconceived ideas about where women fit in, and we're going to change this thing together. And so that's why, for me, the mainstreaming of women's issues is an absolute importance, because then we're not going to shift the needle until we make sure that those things are debated in Parliament, they debated in Congresses, people are running. I want to see one day a colleague of mine running an internal campaign about saying, I want, a male colleague saying, I want to rid our party processes or our internal legal processes of the kind of sexism that we see. I want to see that kind of stuff. And I don't want that to be limited to just female colleagues. And so really mainstreaming that kind of conversation is incredibly important. And that's the only way we're going to stop this whole thing of sexual harassment, sexism in the workplace, is when men realize that it's just as important that they become champions of a truly equal work environment and not just women having the discussion themselves.
Thank you, Sue. I agree. Ambassador. Oh, sorry, I think you're still on mute. Oh, Ambassador, you might still, oh, yep, now you're okay.
Yes, thank you. Yes, of course, Me Too movement, for instance, has been extremely important. And I think that in Finland in most workplaces, and especially within the government. And for instance, in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, there is really zero tolerance for sexual exploitation and harassment. So the mechanisms in place are quite effective. So lots of people have been removed from their posts after having been caught of sexual exploitation, even in the foreign ministry, actually. But then I would like to follow up on the point that Sivive mentioned concerning the segregation of political positions, because this has been a challenge also in Finland, and I think that our parliament made a study on that during the previous parliamentary term, how men and women are divided in different committees of the parliament, and of course there you could really see the segregation, that the so-called hard politics is still very much the realm of men, like defense, foreign affairs to some extent, and so on. But I think there has been some positive developments after that study was made, and now during this parliamentary term, it's already more balanced, and we are very aware of this question. Of course, segregation of education and labor markets in general is a problem in Finland, but we have had the first female Minister of Defense in the world, for instance, and we have women in so-called hard politics. And for instance, Minister of Police was just mentioned by Sivive, our Minister of the Interior, who is in charge of police in Finland. She is or was a youngish woman, but she just left for maternity leave, which I also would like to flag that in Finland it's possible for ministers to have maternity leave and then return back to the government. Actually, there will be a reshuffle in her party. She will not return to the same post, but this is actually her own will. But this is possible in Finland. Thank you.
And I think still a challenge here in the UK that we're talking about maternity leave for members of parliament and certainly for the executive. I think thinking about the Summit for Democracy and the discussion that will happen tomorrow and in the coming days, we've covered such a wide range of areas that need addressing. And I think some really practical steps that you've put forward on how women and the need for women to be represented, and how we can reach out to those that are marginalized or sidelined, but also importantly, how to bring women's issues into the mainstream. I mean, it's not just women's issues. We've found, and some of the links in the chat are to reports that both DemoFinland and WFD have worked on over the last couple of years to drive the evidence that shows that when women political leaders have the space to be in positions like yours, Ambassador, and like yours, Sivive, and certainly like Maria's, that we find that real issues of gender equality are addressed. And the benefits and who that benefits, it's not just women and girls, it's certainly boys and men, it's the whole of society. And we have healthier lives, we have more equal spaces, we have opportunities, and certainly more peaceful societies. I think the last question before we end, and sorry, I'll also mention the discussion about cultural change, because I think this is really important, that political parties and political institutions themselves need to be spaces where women want to be present, and there needs to be a lot of self-reflection there about how to create those spaces so that women join us from other sectors, and certainly that other sectors are where persons like yourselves in leadership positions can connect up and work with certainly the civil society and women's rights movements. So the last question, and I hope that this is a positive question, and it's about this issue again of cultural change within political parties. It's been raised by all of you, and the importance of working with men. One of our questioners says that at the moment it feels that we're a little bit dependent on the goodwill of male leadership for this. And do you think there are any different approaches that we could be more effective, or how can we claim that space? Sylvie.
Okay, look, I take the criticism, and I think it's absolutely apt. I think that there's often almost as though we are asking men to hold space for us. I mean, it's great that we can have allies in our male colleagues, but ultimately this is not a negotiation. The fact that we want equal representation of women in politics and in leadership is not a negotiation with our male counterparts. It's not permission seeking. It's something that is an imperative, and it's something that's important. And this is something that has been backed up by research. It's, as I said earlier, it's something that's been backed up by research that organizations are intrinsically better at their jobs when they are diverse. And so this is not a matter of asking the goodwill of men to allow us in, show us a little, show us a bit of kindness and give us a small space at the table. We've got to demand that. If we care about our countries, we've got to demand that organizations be diverse. If we say that we care about industries and what and how they're able to perform, if we care about how parliaments are able to do their jobs, then we've also got to be able to demand that more and more people who come from various backgrounds be included in the decision-making table. Otherwise, then we are simply being passengers and almost passive participants in our own countries, in our own democracies. And I think a lot more women and a lot more people don't want to be passive sort of passengers in sort of a democracy of their own country. And as I said earlier, I mean, I take the criticism, and it's true. We've got to be a lot more forceful, but we've also got to, as I said, there is evidence that backs all of this up. This is not a matter of saying 50-50 looks nice. It's simply about evidence-based that when organizations are diverse, they are intrinsically better at what they do. And so therefore, we've got to look at legislation. We've got to look at policies. We've got to look at what I said earlier about how organizations are doing, how they're attracting talent into their own ranks, how that talent is then vetted, and how that organizational culture is either repelling or attracting people to it. All of these things are practical examples of how women who are already in politics can be instrumental in making sure that more and more women are included in political leadership.
Ambassador, thank you very much, Stevie. We couldn't agree more, and I think those are such a good call to action for us to take away. But before we finish, Ambassador, Finland has such an excellent track record, as you said, and a long history of women's voices being present. So likewise, does it feel like in Finland there's a case to be made that that women have claimed the space already, that women are seen as equal participants and drivers of change, and therefore legitimate in the political space?
Yes, I would say so that in Finland we don't feel that we are any longer dependent on the goodwill of men, but of course, I mean, we are not a fully gender equal society yet. There are lots of challenges, violence against women, gender pay gaps, digital gender divide. I mean, you just name it. But I think that we have realized as a small and originally poor society, like 100 years ago, we have realized that we have to harness the resources of the whole society. I mean, Finland couldn't afford to use the resources of only half of the society. And I would say that our gender equality is kind of combination of structural factors all these conducive factors like social security, childcare, and so on. But then also some really strong politicians, strong personalities. Like I mentioned, our former president Tarja Halonen. One example that I always personally like to mention is that when she was Minister for Foreign Affairs, because before becoming president, she was Minister for Foreign Affairs. She was quite well known for her willingness to, let's say, not to accept the proposals for appointments that came to human resources from human resources department. She sent them back and told that give me a female candidate. And I think that the fact that we have now 47% of our ambassadors, our heads of mission abroad are women, I think this is partly result from this way of behaving, this very determined way of behaving. So you need to have some strong personalities, but then also the structures.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Sivive, and certainly thank you, Maria, and thank you all for joining us today. We are running out of time, but I certainly take some of the words that you've just said, Ambassador, that we as a society cannot afford to leave women out. There is still a lot more to be done to bring us into the conversation, but also to bring us legitimately into the decision-making space. We've heard about a lot of the ways that women are fundamentally changing the face of international relations and politics, and hopefully that we agree that this is an international challenge and an international endeavour. And also, as you said, it takes a lot of determination. And I thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Sivive, and thank you, Maria, for your determination for claiming your space. And we really look forward to seeing some of these discussions picked up tomorrow in the Summit for Democracy event, which colleagues have posted in the chat, and hopefully into the next year of action on advancing the status of women as it does advance the status of our democracies, and that women certainly as political leaders are essential for democracies to thrive. So thank you all very, very much, and hope to continue the conversation online and elsewhere.